America has a complicated relationship with its own history. It builds things, tears them down, paves over what's left, and moves on without much ceremony. Some of what got destroyed was genuinely extraordinary. Places that defined an era, a city, or a whole way of life, and are now so completely gone that most people have never heard of them. These are the 8 iconic American places that were completely destroyed and forgotten. Number 8, Dreamland, Coney Island, New York. Before Disneyland, before Six Flags, before the entire concept of the modern theme park had been codified into a formula, there was Coney Island. And at the height of the Coney Island era, the most spectacular thing on that strip of Brooklyn beachfront was a park called Dreamland. Dreamland opened in 1904 and was designed from the ground up to outdo its neighbors. Luna Park and Steeplechase Park were already operating on Coney Island and drawing enormous crowds, so the people behind Dreamland decided the only strategy was excess. The park was built around a central tower that rose 375 feet and was lit by over 1 million electric lights. At a time when electricity was still something most Americans encountered as a novelty rather than a utility. The effect at night was reportedly visible from miles out at sea. The attractions inside were a particular product of their era, genuinely spectacular by the standards of 1904 and genuinely uncomfortable by the standards of today. There was a ride called Shoot the Chutes, a creation billed as the world's largest ballroom, a midget city called Lilliputian, where 300 little people lived and worked as a continuous public exhibition, a reenactment of the Boer War with hundreds of performers, and a disaster simulation called Fighting the Flames, in which a 6-story building was set on fire and rescued multiple times daily by a theatrical fire company. The crowds loved all of it. Dreamland lasted just 7 years. On the night of May 26, 1911, a malfunctioning lamp in the Hell Gate attraction started a fire that spread with a speed that stunned the firefighters who responded. The park's structures were largely wood, painted canvas, and plaster, materials that had been built for spectacle, not for resilience. By the time fire companies arrived from across Brooklyn, sections of the park were already beyond saving. The fire lit the night sky over Coney Island and was visible from ships far out at sea, which was, historically, what the park's electric tower had been designed to do under rather different circumstances. By morning, Dreamland was essentially gone. The tower, the ballroom, every attraction, reduced to smoldering rubble along the waterfront. The animals from the park's menagerie that survived the initial fire escaped into the surrounding area. A lion named Black Prince was eventually cornered and shot on the beach. Other animals were killed in the street or on the sand. It was a chaotic, grim end to something that had been, by the standards of the era, genuinely wondrous. The land was never rebuilt into anything comparable. A stadium occupied the site for decades. Today, the location where Dreamland once stood is a parking lot adjacent to what remains of Coney Island's amusement district. There is no marker, there is no memorial, it is a parking lot. Number 7. The original Penn Station, New York City, New York. If there is a single act of architectural destruction in American history that produced the most lasting consequences for how Americans think about historic preservation, it is the demolition of the original Pennsylvania station in New York City. Penn Station was completed in 1910 and was, by virtually any measure, one of the great buildings of its era. The main waiting room, the general waiting room, was modeled after the baths of Caracalla in Rome and was larger than the nave of St. Peter's Basilica. The concourse was a vast iron and glass structure covering the train platforms, nearly 1,000 feet long, lit by natural light through enormous arched windows. The entire complex covered 2 full city blocks and was entered through a row of Doric columns that announced very clearly that you were entering something that considered itself important. It was built by the Pennsylvania Railroad, the most powerful railroad company in the country at the time, and it served as the primary gateway for millions of passengers arriving in and departing from New York City for 5 decades. At its peak, over 100 million passengers a year moved through it. By the late 1950s, the Pennsylvania Railroad was losing money. Passenger rail travel had been in decline for years, and the company decided the most valuable thing it owned was the real estate under its Manhattan buildings. In 1962, the railroad announced that Penn Station would be demolished and replaced with a new, smaller underground station beneath a sports and entertainment complex, what became Madison Square Garden. Demolition began in October 1963. The reaction among architects, preservationists, critics, and a significant portion of the general public was louder than anything that had preceded it, but ultimately insufficient. The columns were knocked down over the course of months. The waiting room was stripped. The iron and glass concourse, which critics had called one of the finest pieces of industrial architecture in the world, was dismantled section by section and hauled to a landfill in the Secaucus Meadowlands of New Jersey, where portions of it remain to this day buried under fill. The architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable wrote at the time, "We will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed." It is one of the most quoted lines in American architectural history, and it came directly from watching Penn Station come down. The demolition produced a concrete political outcome. New York City's Landmarks Preservation Law was passed in 1965, creating the legal framework for designating and protecting historic structures. When the city later faced a proposal to build a skyscraper above Grand Central Terminal, itself threatened with demolition, the law provided the mechanism to fight it. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the landmark designation in Penn Central Transportation Commerce v. New York City in 1978. Grand Central survives today in large part because Penn Station did not. The current underground Penn Station is, by wide consensus, one of the worst large transit facilities in the developed world. It serves more passengers per day than any other rail station in North America, while providing nearly none of the civic experience its predecessor offered. The contrast between what was there and what replaced it gets cited reliably and repeatedly as the definitive American example of what is lost when preservation loses. Number 6. Greenwood District, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood District of Tulsa, Oklahoma was, in the early decades of the 20th century, one of the most prosperous African-American communities in the United States. The area had developed rapidly after the land run of 1889 and the subsequent oil boom that made Tulsa one of the wealthiest cities in the country. Black entrepreneurs, locked out of white-owned businesses and financial institutions by segregation, built their own, and built them exceptionally well. By 1921, the district stretching along Greenwood Avenue in North Tulsa contained over 35 blocks of Black-owned businesses, hotels, law offices, doctors' offices, pharmacies, grocery stores, theaters, and professional services. It had 2 newspapers, a library, a hospital, and a school system. The concentration of wealth and professional attainment was extraordinary enough that the area was known nationally as Black Wall Street, a name coined by Booker T. Washington during an earlier visit. On the night of May 31st and into June 1st, 1921, a white mob, assisted in some documented accounts by members of the Tulsa Police Department and by individuals who had been deputized by city officials, attacked the Greenwood District. They came on foot, in cars, and, according to multiple eyewitness accounts and a subsequent state investigation, in aircraft that fired on the district and dropped incendiary devices. The attack lasted approximately 18 hours. When it ended, Over 35 square blocks of the Greenwood district had been burned to the ground. Between 100 and 300 people were killed. The official count has never been definitively established, and investigations in the 1990s and 2000s identified probable mass grave sites that had not been disclosed at the time. Over 10,000 Black residents were left homeless. Around 1,200 homes and businesses were destroyed. The Tulsa Race Massacre, as it is now formally designated, was suppressed in public discourse for decades. It did not appear in Oklahoma state history textbooks until 2000. The events were not taught in Tulsa public schools for most of the 20th century. The survivors, many of whom rebuilt on the same land because they had nowhere else to go, largely did not speak publicly about what they had witnessed for fear of further violence. A 2001 state commission formally documented the massacre and recommended reparations to survivors and descendants. No reparations were paid. Some of the original Greenwood commercial buildings were later demolished not by the mob, but by urban renewal projects in the 1960s and 1970s, completing the physical erasure of the district the mob had started. A small portion of the area has been preserved as a historic district. Most of it is gone. Number 5. The Garden of the Gods. Hotel, Colorado Springs, Colorado. Not every destroyed American landmark was lost to violence or civic negligence. Some were lost to the simplest possible combination of factors. The owners ran out of money, nobody with the means to save it stepped forward in time, and the building came down. The Garden of the Gods Hotel in Colorado Springs. Colorado was not the most famous hotel in America, but it was, for a period in the early 20th century, genuinely spectacular. A sprawling resort hotel built in a Pueblo Revival style directly against the backdrop of the red sandstone formations of the Garden of the Gods, one of the most dramatic natural landscapes in the American West. The hotel opened in 1918 and catered to the wealthy tourists and health seekers who had been coming to Colorado Springs since the late 19th century. The dry, high-altitude air of the Front Range had a long-standing and medically promoted reputation as beneficial to people with respiratory conditions, tuberculosis in particular, and the area had built a substantial resort economy around that reputation going back to the 1870s. The Garden of the Gods Hotel was positioned at the top of that market, with manicured grounds, a golf course, riding stables, tennis courts, and views that genuinely did not require embellishment in the promotional literature. It operated through several ownership changes across the mid-20th century, gradually becoming less financially viable as the post-World War II travel economy shifted toward motels, car culture, and destinations in Florida, California, and the new ski resorts of Colorado's mountains. By the 1970s, the hotel had closed. A succession of potential buyers and preservation proposals failed to materialize into anything. The structure sat empty and deteriorated. Vandalism accelerated the damage, and the building's condition eventually passed the point where renovation was financially justifiable to any prospective owner. The hotel was demolished in 1996 after nearly 2 decades of vacancy. The land was developed into a residential community. The Garden of the Gods Park itself, the natural sandstone formation the hotel was built to overlook, is now managed by the city of Colorado Springs as a public park and receives hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. They stand among the red rock formations and photograph the scenery and have no particular reason to know that for decades, guests at a first-class resort hotel stood in approximately the same spot and paid handsomely for the privilege. Number 4. Sportsman's Park, St. Louis, Missouri. There are lost ballparks all over America, old stadiums that housed generations of games, sat at the center of entire neighborhood social lives, and were demolished when the team left or the stadium aged past usefulness. Sportsman's Park in St. Louis is one of the best examples of how completely a place can be erased. Sportsman's Park, originally called Grand Avenue Grounds and later renamed multiple times, sat at the corner of Grand and Dodier in North St. Louis and hosted professional baseball for over a century, from 1866 until 1966, a run that no other ballpark in American history has matched. It was home to the St. Louis Cardinals from 1920 until 1966, and had previously hosted the St. Louis Browns and various other teams going back to the 19th century. The 1944 World Series, the only all-St. Louis World Series, with the Browns facing the Cardinals, was played entirely within its walls. The park sat in a working-class residential neighborhood. The surrounding streets were filled with the homes of families whose social calendar revolved, at least partly, around what was happening at the corner of Grand and Dodier. The bars nearby, the parking arrangements, the rhythm of game days, this was embedded into the neighborhood's identity for multiple generations. The Cardinals moved to the new Bush Memorial Stadium in downtown St. Louis in 1966. Sportsman's Park was purchased by the Herbert Hoover Boys Club, later renamed the Herbert Hoover Boys and Girls Club, for the sum of $1. The transaction was largely symbolic. The organization had been associated with the site for years, and the dollar purchase was a recognition that the building's value to the community was more meaningful than its market value to anyone else. The old grandstands were demolished, and the site was converted into a youth recreation facility, which it continues to operate as today. The surrounding neighborhood, once dense with the residences of working-class families whose lives overlapped with the rhythm of the baseball seasons, had already been changing. Urban renewal projects, highway construction, and demographic shifts had been remaking North St. Louis for years before the stadium came down. The community that had organized itself partly around the presence of professional baseball at that corner had been dispersing by degrees before the final game was even played. There is a historical marker near the entrance of the current facility acknowledging the site's baseball history. The orientation of the grounds loosely echoes the original diamond layout. If you didn't know to look for it, you would see a community center and a youth sports field and have no reason to suspect that you were standing on a century of professional baseball history, including the only all-St. Louis World Series ever played. Number 3, Riverview Park, Chicago, Illinois. Riverview Park was for the first half of the 20th century one of the most attended amusement parks in the United States. It operated on the north side of Chicago along the North Branch of the Chicago River from 1904 until 1967, drawing millions of visitors annually with a combination of roller coasters, carnival rides, games, a ballroom, a freak show, and the general atmosphere of mid-century American popular entertainment at its most unrefined. At its peak, Riverview had over 100 rides and attractions. Its roller coasters were a particular draw. The Bob's, which opened in 1924, was considered one of the finest wooden coasters in the country and remained a flagship attraction into the 1960s. The parachute drop towers, were visible from miles away. The Shoot the Chutes water ride had been there since the park's earliest years. The Fireball, the Comet, the Silver Flash. These were rides that generations of Chicago families rode together on summer evenings, and that are described in accounts from the era with the kind of nostalgic specificity that suggests genuine love. Riverview was also a product of its era in ways that are harder to look back on comfortably. The park was segregated. Black visitors were barred or restricted throughout much of its history, only fully desegregating in the late 1950s and early 1960s. The freak show ran continuously for decades with the kind of displays that are no longer considered acceptable. These are not footnotes to the park's history, but part of it. The park was sold in 1967 to a group of developers. The announced reasons for the closure included declining attendance, the rising cost of maintaining infrastructure that dated back to the park's earliest years, and concerns about the safety of the surrounding neighborhood, a framing that, given the timing, reflected broader anxieties about urban America in the late 1960s as much as it reflected specific conditions at Riverview. Whether those concerns were the full story or a convenient explanation for a decision that had already been made financially is a question that former patrons and local historians have debated for decades. The rides were auctioned off and sold individually, traveling to parks across the country or being scrapped. The Bobs, the roller coaster that had been a Chicago institution for 43 years, was demolished in place. There was no buyer willing to take on the cost of moving it. The physical plant, the structures, the grounds, all of it was cleared. The land was divided. The Chicago Police Department acquired a portion and built a training facility. A shopping center developer acquired the rest, and Riverview Plaza opened on the site in 1972. Today, the shopping center has been redeveloped and rebranded multiple times. As strip mall retail tends to be, a police training facility continues to operate on the adjacent parcel. There is, on the current site, no marker, no memorial, and no acknowledgement in the physical landscape that one of the most attended amusement parks in American history operated there for 63 consecutive years. Comedian Bob Hope, who had performed at Riverview in its earlier years, remarked when he heard of the closure, Riverview was Chicago, not a part of Chicago, Chicago. It is, by most assessments, the only public statement from a recognizable name that marked the park's passing with anything resembling appropriate weight. Number 2, the Salton Riviera, Salton Sea, California. This one requires a little setup because the Salton Sea itself is something that many people don't realize exists, let alone that it once had a resort community on its shores. The Salton Sea is a large, shallow salt lake in the Imperial Valley of Southern California, sitting about 226 feet below sea level in the Colorado Desert. It was created accidentally in 1905 when an irrigation canal diversion from the Colorado River failed, sending the river's flow into the Salton Basin for nearly 2 years before the break was repaired. By the time the flooding stopped, a lake roughly 35 miles long and 15 miles wide had formed in what had previously been dry desert. The lake persisted, fed by agricultural runoff from the Imperial Valley and the Coachella Valley. In the 1950s, developers and the California Department of Fish and Game recognized what they thought was an opportunity. The Salton Sea was stocked with fish. Marinas were built on the North Shore. Hotels, motels, vacation homes, yacht clubs, and beach resorts were developed at places called Desert Shores, Bombay Beach, and Salton City. The Salton Riviera, as the development was collectively marketed, was promoted as the next Palm Springs, a desert resort destination accessible from Los Angeles within a few hours. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Salton Sea was genuinely popular. More annual visitors came to the Salton Sea than to Yosemite in some years during that period. Celebrities and wealthy Angelenos kept vacation homes on the North Shore. Speedboat races were held on the lake. The ski clubs and yacht clubs had waiting lists. Then several things went wrong simultaneously. Agricultural runoff brought increasing volumes of fertilizer and pesticide residue into the lake, which has no natural outlet. The salinity climbed as evaporation concentrated dissolved minerals. The nutrient load from runoff triggered massive algae blooms, which triggered fish die-offs. Dead fish washed up on the beaches in numbers that rendered them unusable. The smell, on warm days, was reportedly extraordinary in the worst possible way. Flooding in the mid-1970s inundated some of the shoreline development. Visitors stopped coming, the resorts closed, the vacation homes were abandoned. What remains of the Salton Riviera today is one of the stranger landscapes in the American West. The bones of the resort communities are still there. Streets, foundations, the remnants of a marina, a motel sign standing in dry dust. Bombay Beach, on the eastern shore, has a small permanent population and an art installation community that has moved into the ruins. The desert has reclaimed much of what was built, and the shoreline continues to retreat and change as the lake level fluctuates. The Salton Sea itself is now the subject of significant environmental concern. It is a major stopover for migratory birds on the Pacific Flyway, and its degradation threatens that ecosystem. State and federal agencies have been discussing restoration plans for decades. The resort community that briefly made it famous is not part of those discussions. That chapter is considered closed. Number 1. Seneca Village, New York City, New York. Central Park is one of the most visited urban parks in the world. It occupies 843 acres in the middle of Manhattan and is so thoroughly woven into the identity of New York City that it is difficult to imagine the island without it. Most people who walk through it have no idea that creating it required the forcible displacement of a community of over 1,600 people and the complete physical erasure of a neighborhood that, by the standards of its time, was remarkable. Seneca Village was established in 1825 on land in the Upper West Side of Manhattan that was, at the time, far outside the developed city. It grew into a predominantly African-American community, one of the first in New York City, where Black residents owned property in significant numbers. By the 1850s, the village had 3 churches, 2 schools, and a population that included a notable proportion of property owners at a time when property ownership was still tied to voting rights in New York State. An 1855 census counted 264 residents, of whom the majority were African American, with Irish and German immigrant families also present. The community was stable, established, and in many respects flourishing by the mid-19th century standards. The 3 churches, All Angels Church, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and Colored School No. 3, served both spiritual and civic functions for the neighborhood. The property records show generations of families who had built real roots there. In 1853, the New York State Legislature authorized the city to acquire the land for what would become Central Park. The eminent domain proceedings moved quickly. Residents were given notice that they would be displaced and compensated. Many challenged the condemnation in court, arguing that the compensation offered was inadequate, which, by most assessments, it was. The legal challenges were unsuccessful. By 1857, virtually all of Seneca Village's residents had been displaced, their buildings demolished, and the land cleared for park construction. The actual construction of Central Park began in 1858 under landscape architects Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, who won the design competition with their greensward plan. For most of the following century and a half, Seneca Village's existence was not widely known or discussed. Central Park's official histories focused on the transformation of wild land into a designed landscape. The community that had been removed to make that transformation possible was largely absent from those accounts. Archaeological excavations in the park began in 2011, conducted by researchers from Columbia University and other institutions. They found the physical evidence of the village, building foundations, artifacts of daily life, the remains of the material world of a mid-19th century New York community. The excavations confirmed the historical record and added granular detail about how the residents had lived. Central Park is extraordinary. It has been, by any measure, one of the most successful urban public spaces ever created. The cost of building it included the destruction of a community that had every right to exist where it was and received nothing close to adequate compensation for losing what it had. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the second one spent over 150 years being largely invisible. As historian Roy Rosenzweig, who co-authored A History of Central Park, wrote, The story of Seneca Village is the story of who gets to build the city and who gets moved out of the way so someone else can. 8 places that were extraordinary in their time and are now either completely gone or so thoroughly transformed that nothing of what they were remains in the physical landscape. Some were destroyed by fire, some by violence, some by the slow pressure of changing economics and shifting travel patterns, and some by the deliberate decisions of people who wanted the land for something else and had the power to take it. The thing they all share, beyond the destruction, is the forgetting. A parking lot in Brooklyn where 1 million light bulbs once lit the night. A landfill in New Jersey where some of the finest iron columns in American architecture are buried. A shopping center in Chicago where 3 generations of families rode the bobs. An empty grid of streets in Pennsylvania where the ground is still on fire. Places become invisible when the people with the means and the motivation to remember them are no longer around or no longer trying. That is not always an accident. Sometimes forgetting is the intended outcome. If this one was worth your time, hit that like button and subscribe. There's a lot more of this to come.